when you trade different products around the world, there should be a unified way of doing all of this, right? Like, whilst we all speak a lot of different languages, there's lots of different currencies, a lot of us have the same needs. So there is like a slight more unity than we realize.
Henry Duckworth, founder and chief executive officer of AgriDex.
What we wanted to do with Agri-Dex eventually is let people tell a story with their food. A big part of the 21st century has been brand value. A lot of the companies that have done the best in the world, whether it's LVMH or Hermes or any of these companies, have been people that built up a brand value. And actually, even when it comes to crypto, Michael Saylor with his MicroStrategy group keeps on talking about the idea of Bitcoin being a value proposition, like a brand value. And that's why he's buying it and he's trying to control most of the supply, and that increases the value further down the line. The one thing that all of us do is we eat. Every single person on the planet has to eat to survive. And yet there isn't actually a huge amount of brand value in our basic foods. There is on some of the high value stuff, your caviars or your champagnes, but most food doesn't have a brand value. And I think it's because most food doesn't have a story. We don't know very much about the foods that we buy. We walk into a shop and we go, well, I want to eat peaches today. So we buy a packet of peaches, but we don't know the farmer who made it. We don't know how it got to you. We don't know the passion behind the product. And actually that shouldn't be that hard. Using our system, and we're building this in with tracking and tracing, you should be able to scan a QR code and learn a little bit about the story of the farmer and how that product got to you.
What is your viewpoint in terms of crop yields moving forward with, climate change?
Climate change in and of itself can be exclusionary to some people. I think what everyone should care about is protecting soil. We've seen from the Dust Bowl of America in the 30s to desertification in southern Saharan regions. It's incredibly important, and we see what happens when you don't treat soil well. So relentlessly focusing on overall yield I don't believe is the answer. It may work in the Midwest where you have access to great inputs and you can regularly top up, I guess, but it doesn't work well in a lot of the emergent world. So I think focusing on crops and custodying your soils in a better fashion is incredibly important. I think it's one of the 3 or 4 things that humanity needs to concentrate on the most. We need to stop focusing on yield alone and start focusing on protection of our biospheres.
Bonded by Science, proudly presented by Noble Blocks.
Thanks, Henry, for joining us on Bonded by Science. Super excited to meet another blockchain app developer, but you're doing more than just an app. I would say you're building an ecosystem, and I would love to unfold that with you. But I would first like to ask a really, really straightforward question, and that is like, when you open your eyes in the morning, what is the first thing that often runs through your mind?
Oh, it's a really good question. I guess the big thing for me is always what's going on with the company. I wake up and I usually at 6 a.m. I open my eyes. What can we achieve today? That's probably the first thought in my mind. Just what can we achieve today? So I do about an hour sat in bed, scrolling through all the various tasks, contacting and sending forward all the messages to various team members. I think everyone gets very annoyed because between the hours about 5 and 7, they get this litany of requests in detail coming out from me. And then I get up, shower, stretch, and I go on with my day. But those first sort of hour to 2 hours in bed, I find bizarrely some of the most productive because no one's talking at me or getting in front of me. But achievements are the big thing that I always think every day. What can we achieve today?
I like how honest you are about saying that you scroll your phone in the bed in the morning, because there's so many, I don't want to call them health junkies, because I do think that they have a lot of really sound advice, but it's like, okay, when you wake up in the morning, don't look at your phone, get that dose of sunlight, go barefoot in the garden, put your feet on the ground and sort of get that grounding. But we actually just had another guest also on the podcast who said, yeah, no, the first half hour I spent on my phone in the morning in bed, knocking off my tasks or to-do thing, my to-do list. So I think that is really nice for other people to hear.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I have a very sociable life still, but for me, living's kind of in the afternoon and evenings, I like seeing friends. I like going to the theater, art, culture. But I can achieve that sort of at the end of my working day. I just feel like the morning is such a productive time. I never quite get how people can switch off and meditate. Maybe I need to. Maybe I need to speak to those people. But for me, I like running through my tasks and setting it up.
Well, I heard that whatever works for you, and as long as you're consistent at it, then it shouldn't matter. So if you're like someone that really likes to work out at night, as long as you do that consistently, then it shouldn't really matter in the long run. The whole point is consistency. So once you find what works for you, just keep going. So I don't think this podcast should be a reason that you change your your morning routine. Um, I know, Henry, like before you started building AgriDex, you also had a background in commodities, right? And in trading, is that correct?
Yeah, so my first job, I was a a law graduate, and I always wanted to be involved in trade. I grew up in Zimbabwe, which is not exactly at the forefront of technological advance. It's a very young country with a very new network of both technology and people. So a lot of the industry and trade that you see there is very physical by its nature. So those are the things that I kind of understood, and I also saw the value proposition in that. Um, and I knew that one day I wanted to do something like what I've done. So I wanted to go into trade first. So I went in with a suit to a very smart office in London and went to the world's biggest trader at Trafigura and got a job, and then was immediately sent out to the Congo, where I didn't get to wear smart suits. It wasn't quite the same. I thought law graduate from London, maybe they'll stick me in Switzerland and I'll do fancy trading of oil to New York. But no, it was Cobalt in Congo, which was a really interesting journey because everyone in the world touches Congo a little bit like everyone in the world touches food. A lot of the world's cobalt comes out of Congo, and a lot of the other kind of resources that we all use. So even though it's at times chaotic and definitely a very difficult country to deal in, it also produces a lot of the commodities that we all use. And cobalt's one of the most important. It's used in everything from rockets and nuclear weapons to our cell phones and our electric cars.
Yeah, it's very critical metal right now. So you hear a lot of it being talked about in terms, especially in EVs. I think most of the time, I hear a lot coming up in EVs and along with many others. So would you say that sort of shaped your path, like going to Congo? Because what you're doing now is also involving many parts of the world. Not necessarily with cobalt, but maybe at some point it might if you expand it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those roles where it's like if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. I think if you can
It
make
was
it as
your
a
New York.
trader in a sort of civil war zone, taking out hundreds of millions of dollars product every month and getting it across the world, like you can do anything. So it definitely informed my confidence, but I think also kind of what you realize when you trade different products around the world is you're like, there should be a unified way of doing all of this, right? Like, whilst we all speak a lot of different languages, there's lots of different currencies, et cetera, et cetera. Like, a lot of us have the same needs, both in the calorific contents our bodies need and in what we all want in life. So there is like a slight more unity than we realize. And it definitely kind of informed my position, which is that there had to be a better way of trading goods, trading products.
And when you say better, are you talking about transparency? Because I know AgriDex is like that's one of its main advantage. Like that's one advantage. I know there are others.
Yeah. So I mean, it's transparency for us will be amazing and it should be. It's something that I'm personally very passionate about. I think I was invited to speak in Parliament last week in the UK, and part of my speech was just talking about how what we wanted to do with AgriDex eventually is let people tell a story with their food. A big part of the 21st century has been brand value. A lot of the companies that have done the best in the world, whether it's LVMH or Hermes or any of these companies, have been people that built up a brand value. And actually, even when it comes to crypto, Michael Saylor with his MicroStrategy group keeps on talking about the idea of Bitcoin being a value proposition, like a brand value, and that's why he's buying it and he's trying to control most of the supply, and that increases the value further down the line. Well, the one thing that all of us do is we eat. Every single person on the planet has to eat to survive, and yet there isn't actually a huge amount of brand value in our basic foods. There is on some of the high value stuff, your caviars or your champagnes, but most food doesn't have a brand value, and I think it's because most food doesn't have a story. We don't know very much about the foods that we buy. We walk into a shop and we go, well, I want to eat peaches today. So we buy a packet of peaches, but we don't know the farmer who made it. We don't know how it got to you. We don't know the passion behind the product. And actually, that shouldn't be that hard. Using our system, and we're building this in with tracking and tracing, you should be able to scan a QR code and learn a little bit about the story of the farmer and how that product got to you. Because some of us like organic food, some of us don't care, some of us like these types of food, some of us vegetarian, some of us aren't, etc. But I think what most of us are happy to do is to know the story of food if we could. And most of us want farmers to do it in a more equitable fashion, and also want to know that the quality of the food is good. And I think you can give those indicators quite easily. It's just not something that's been done before at scale. And I think it's something that we're building into right now.
Okay, so when you reflect on what you learned when you were in Congo, when you were responsible for the trade of cobalt that was coming out of there, and you said that there could be a better way. Now, you were not just thinking about transparency. Were there other things that crossed your mind?
Yeah, I think a big part of trade is bottlenecks. There's a huge amount of bottlenecks around the world. For example, I've done a lot of trade of agri-stuffs out of West Africa, and things like in Nigeria, Lagos port, when I was dealing through that, had like a month-long delay. So you'd pack a container full of cocoa beans that would one day come to New York to be processed into chocolate bars, and they would then just sit there in a container by the port in not very good weather for an entire month sometimes. And you think, that can't be right. There's got to be a way of optimizing this flow. So I think, trade is a very thirsty animal. It thrives on data points. So the more registered data points that you can provide in real time, the better the flow process will occur. And it's not just that, right? Like, it's like a unified language. Instead of going from, let's say if we're in Congo, instead of going from a guy who speaks Kikongo, trying to understand a French document that then is loaded up and somebody else in the world has to translate it into English before then translating it into Dutch because the product's ending up in the Netherlands, and you've got these multiple things. Having some sort of AI scraper to give a unified language would be amazing. But not just that, having one agreed sort of language and also documentation flow, like a smart contract, would remove so much of those issues, because you've not got 4 different translations now. You've not got 4 different ways of doing things. You've not got documents being sent around the world unnecessarily, and just like, think of the carbon footprint of, like, most trades in the world up until quite recently have had wet ink documents sent. So like, whether you're buying small, increments of cashew from Tanzania or large bulk wheat from Ukraine, people often insist on sending the actual physical document that's been signed in wet ink. And you're thinking, my God, like, I mean, I know DHL loves this sort of business, but like, who else is benefiting from these unnecessary paperwork being flown around the world? It doesn't make sense. Smart contracts need to start removing a huge amount of this unnecessary carbon output and time output that has been produced by people who like to see a physical representation of their documents when it's not necessary. It's no longer necessary to do that. And especially with, this new digital act here in the UK from last year, actually you can hash out these contracts. There's no need for you to be physically given them.
And for those that are listening that don't know what a smart contract is, because most people understand the concept of a contract, but when you say smart contract, what do you actually mean there?
It's a digital representation thereof. You talk about hashing it, which means the information that is needed for it to be legally binding is put in to the code, and that's really it. It's just a digital representation of your legal documentation.
Yeah, but it's coded though. It's not a piece of paper.
Exactly. It's coded, but it still gives you the same strength of conviction. And actually it means that you guys don't have to fuss around with, not even with faxes. So it's more old school than even faxes. It's like the fax machine got invented, but we were still sending documents around. And that was, I don't know how long ago. People started using fax a long time ago.
Yeah, it's long enough that we don't use fax machines anymore. So yeah. Another thing, correct me if I'm wrong, the smart contract you can also code in, like, as soon as one party satisfies an obligation. then the rest of the contract would initiate. So it's sort of like if-then setups in the smart contract.
Yeah, you can build in like momentum, like hurdles, as it were, which is actually like incredibly clever and reactive in a way that like historical contracts weren't. Yeah, you're totally right. Like you can build in momentum, which again is like super cool. That in general there needs to be this next evolution. Like certainly in the UK, like in terms of law, like it always used to be that like there's no written constitution. We kind of pull from precedent, and so like it can become exciting if you can build in this new vision around it.
Yeah. I had a conversation with a good friend of mine, and he said that a lot of the business deals that they do, because of the scale, the magnitude of the deal, that they also have, like you described it as a wet ink contract. So it's like mailed back and forth, and you go through every single page. And one of the reasons that they didn't even want to go into digital signatures, so if you think like really basic, like Adobe Sign, that kind of thing, was because there has never been like any precedent in a court case that held up that those digital signatures remained valid. Is this a rational thought?
I think it's totally rational. I think the reason that we were very excited is there's been an actual act and sort of like stuff laid down here in the UK around it. But I think you should be careful, 100%. I mean, by using our system, by using the Agri-Dex system, you should be, one should be hopefully safe in the knowledge that you can be bound in by English company law. But it's not the same case with other systems in other parts of the world. It's why our system, we believe, is so compelling and so exciting. But it's absolutely the case that you can't do smart contracts that are legally valid with certain other groups in certain other jurisdictions. For us, we're safe in the knowledge, but other people won't be.
And it's not that they're not legally valid. They may actually be, like if it ever had to go to court, it could be deemed legally valid.
What you mean? It's just not been tested yet.
Exactly. And I think that is where a lot of hesitation comes into play, is because it hasn't been tested.
No, and I get that, and I think people should always do their own research. But definitely, I'm not purporting to know about the general work around smart contracts. And I think to totally to agree with you, I think that there are a lot of communities historically, especially in the blockchain world, that have pertained to know what's going on with smart contracts and the legal requirements around it, and they haven't. We're quite lucky that we have several in-house lawyers. We're probably overstacked on law here, partly because I was, studied law myself. We like it, but we also know that it's an incredibly important thing. It's something that we resourced from the very, very beginning. We tried to be reactive and adaptive to what's going on.
I was really excited actually to have this meeting with you, because I've been following your company for a while now, I suppose. And I was at a dinner meeting recently, and I was explaining to those at the table like what you guys were doing, and we got to thinking, and they actually, my guest had a few questions, so I'm going to relay those questions to you. And it has something to do with the smart contract as well. So we were quite curious to know, like, how do you track and make sure the transparency comes into play? Like, so let's say something is grown in place A, it gets shipped to place B, it gets handled by person C, and then as you go through those steps, from what I understand, AgriDex should be able to track that information, providing that transparent flow. How does the tracking work? That was the question.
Yeah, see, the big thing we're building out at the moment is putting a sort of tracker itself on each container. And what that does is it'll send out messages at a registered data point every time you're arriving in a new place. So what it does is it doesn't make risk and corruption immutable. That there's nothing that can do that. But as we spoke earlier about the idea of like trade being a thirsty animal for data points, usually, and what I found, having personally traded commodities around the world, is there's usually a specific point of corruption on a chain. And if you have repeated feedback loops of data, and it's constantly coming in and registering, it becomes very easy to go back to that point and see what's wrong, whether that's at the port, whether there's been a disturbance and products been moved around at port, or whether that's happened at sea. And usually what you'll see is, because we're not a system that's built for small scale one-off use, right? We're built for mid to large traders to be using this to consistently move out product around the world. So you'll have a consistent flow of, let's say, cashew from northern Nigeria to Vietnam, where it's processed. And you'll see, and so the actual role of that would be, well, it's packed in northern Nigeria into containers. Those containers are taken to a port in Lagos, where they are loaded. They are then shipped to a port in Hanoi. They are unloaded and moved to a factory. So you only have 5 positions of movement, let's say, along that chain. And by relaying your product and having it retested in each location, which normally occurs, normally people check on the product itself, they check that it matches with the paperwork, and having a registered data point along that way, that you can then see where the corruption occurred. Were the containers opened up at sea? You'll be able to know that because you have a tracking mechanism that says, well, from here to here it was absolutely fine. It's quite common with products in general to have a unified set of paperwork. So if it's cashew, they'll have a unified set of moisture, outturn, weight. Ditto with cocoa. So it becomes quite easy when you have a tracker that relays the data points in real time to go back to the point where there's been corruption.
And when you say go back to the point that there's been corruption, what type of corruption, in your experience?
Usually what people do is they swap out product itself. A big problem, and you've seen that, like, certainly in Europe, like a big problem's been honey, right? There's apparently something like only a quarter of honey in England is real honey. A lot of it's just sugar syrup. It's just like people like stacking sugar, mix up water.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah. There's like huge problems with like honey. The same thing with like, Sicilian oranges or like tomatoes from Naples. Like a lot of these things, because they're high value products. We spoke earlier about like food not telling a story, and certainly for the ones where it does tell a story, whether that's like high value honey or tomatoes out of lovely parts of like Italy, because the value proposition there is so high, and there's such a differential now between normal products that look slightly the same and those high value products. There's a huge amount of corruption and sort of swapping out of product.
I think it sounds like quite sophisticated corruption. So, like, if you're able to swap out the honey and swap out the tomatoes, and swap out the Sicilian oranges, and replace them with, I guess, not versions of those.
It's very, very sophisticated. And it's also why, like, you often like eat like a tomato from a particular part of southern Italy, and you go like, oh, but it doesn't taste as good as when we were on holiday there. And it's like, okay, that's partly because it was shipped to you fine. But it's also often because it's not a tomato from the amazing place where you ate.
That thought never ever once crossed my mind that someone would have swapped my tomato.
Yeah, and it happens the whole time.
Oh, I feel enlightened.
In England, we had a big problem with meat being horse meat originally. It was a huge problem in the UK. Burgers being made out of horses out of Eastern Europe. So there's a huge amount of corruption and issues in supply chains, especially the ones going into the first world. We think that we're not prone to the same level of issues as the emerging world, but actually because there's more value in getting it to us, there's more reason for people to swap out.
That makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that was just a huge eye-opener for me. I had no idea any of that was going on. I would say the majority of the population doesn't even know that that's going on. I think wow. I just never considered anyone would be swapping my tomatoes. I'm just a little lost for words at the moment. Do you envision that AgriDex could also start developing other types of sensors that would boost the transparency of the ecosystem or the quality control? Is that in your vision?
I think where we've been very good is knowing that other people are better at a lot of stuff. Our system's built to be collaborative, and that's the joy of having this sort of like decentralized global product built on blockchain, is that we can take the best from other people and add it on. And we've done that, like, for example, like we're adding debt obligations. We're going to be adding the ability for people to borrow through Plume, who are a big blockchain group. We're going to be looking at doing stuff around insurance by talking to blockchain insurance groups and getting them to do goods in transit insurance and things on chain. So we're absolutely dedicated to building as much operability as we can over the next coming years. But by being able to have so much interesting stuff put onto the system, we know that we need to be working with other people as well, at least at first. So it's not something I've thought about at all. Sensors and tracking technology in of itself is not something that I'm an expert on.
But it could be something that like a third party could come and approach you and say, we have some really excellent sensors. We think it could add extra data points to your system. And that could be a future opportunity down the line, for example.
I think so. There's, I'm not saying no. We're definitely interested to. We're definitely interested to explore what benefits our community.
Have you met a lot of resistance when you introduced the idea of AgriDex and then dropped the word blockchain? And then I'll second that with crypto, because they are two different things. A lot of people forget that they are two different things, or they just don't know. What is the resistance that you have felt, if any, with those two terms?
The big thing that crypto does, unfortunately, at times is it has exclusionary language. And that comes from the fact that there's almost a religiosity to some parts of the crypto world, which is great. It means that people have an incredible amount of passion. But like anything, like any religious movement, people use a lot of exclusionary language. And I think even stuff like, we talk about AgriDex being an RWA because then it allows people who are in the blockchain and crypto world to understand what we do. But actually, to outside people, that is not only confusing, but it's alienating. You go, oh, well, it's a real world application. And it's like, well, hang on a second. I thought all of this stuff is supposed to be in the real world. What do you mean it's not in the real world? Like, what isn't a real world application? So I think crypto is its biggest hero, but sometimes its biggest enemy in terms of language. And we need to work out a way to signal to normies as much as we do to each other. And then on the blockchain side, I think there's just a slow learning about what it is, from Netscape and things like that in the early 90s to everyone in the world knowing AOL in 2000. There was, 6-7 years. There's that same education level with blockchain, because I think proper usable blockchain products, ideas and things like that, I guess, was when Ethereum went global. I don't know, like 2016, 2017 kind of thing. Like, we're still quite early into the usable blockchain journey. So people are still being educated. But I would guess by the end of this bull cycle in 2026, let's say, I think people will be mostly au fait with blockchain and having seen so many workable projects. Because it's not just us. We've launched a sort of alliance group that's got Parcel and Baxis and a few other real world blockchain uses on in the last couple of days. It's a sort of council, and we're hoping to add more people to it as we go. But there are lots of amazing projects out there already that are working and are doing really cool things now, and I think that just helps with the general education and value proposition.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that, because I see Noble Blocks as a real world application of blockchain technology, and they brought me in. That was my entry into the space generally. So coming in as a scientist, going into DeSci, so decentralized science. And then in that entry, I started to learn all the words that you were talking about that could be very alienating. I didn't know what people were talking about. They were having sentences where I only understood like a third of what they said. So there is a learning curve for someone that wants to get into it. And that's why I was quite curious to hear if you were ever pitching AgriDex and you said blockchain, did people just get really put off by it? Because they don't. I mean, there is still some stigma around it because as soon as you say blockchain, people think crypto.
I think even with some of the people who joined the company, some people didn't understand the value proposition of the wider world of blockchain and crypto as much as they do now. A big thing that we do in the company is kind of radical honesty. We like people to argue with each other. We like there to be no group think and to challenge the ideas that are put forward. But there was definitely some people on the crypto evangelist side who ended up arguing with some people about how we were actually making the product work in of itself, which I like. I think conflict's really, really healthy. Most relationships die actually when you stop arguing with your partner, not when you start, right? So I like a reasonable amount of conflict. But what I did find is that over time, the people who were reasonably new to the blockchain who joined our company are now some of the most evangelical because they see the great benefits that exist. But they themselves were put off at first with exclusionary language and an inability for some people in the system to bend and to understand both sides of the coin.
And AgriDex, you guys recently launched your own coin or token, as some would call it. What was the rationale for doing that? I mean, I'm actually quite curious to hear people's explanations of the real world applications. Why should you have your own coin or token? Why wouldn't you just, you're built on Solana, right? So, what's the rationale for people that don't understand?
Great thing about Web3 is the idea that the first evolution the last evolution was kind of like you use Google to search the things that you need. You use the internet itself to do a myriad of different things with your daily life. But how great to actually own a piece of the internet itself, right? So by buying into Solana, you own a percentage of this system that does so much that you need to do on a day-to-day level. And on top of that, you have people like us. If you are interested in your food chain, if you're eating, if you're involved, why not buy into and own a piece of something that is helping to revolutionize that? So there's that larger, just holistic idea that by buying into AgriDex, you're buying into kind of the future of food. And then there's also a range of utilities for the actual corporate users and traders. You get discounts if you're a user or a trader on the system. You get discounts by owning the token. AgriDex, as a company, also uses 50% of its profits to buy and hold the token itself. So we also align the long-term interests of the company with the token. So there's multiple different features and levels of engagement on the token itself. And that's just the start. We're going to look at building in staking mechanisms. We're going to do a vote this week on locking up aspects of our treasury. There's lots of really exciting stuff.
And what would you say to someone that doesn't understand how the voting mechanisms would work?
I would say don't worry about it.
Okay, that's a
I
good
would say don't
answer.
worry about it. You don't need
How's
to
everything
understand
going?
everything in the world.
Fine.
But what tokens can often do is you can vote on aspects of how the companies run. You can also vote on things that you're interested in personally. We just spoke about tracking and tracing, and you had some great ideas about maybe building our own tracking mechanism. If you're holding the AgriDex token, you can go into our Discord and start a debate on that and say, look, I know some people who have a wonderful tracking mechanism. Here's how it works. Would AgriDex like to fund or finance a further build out of this product to make it work? So it becomes very collaborative. We have some full-time people hired to manage our Discord, and they're very engaged in pushing the value proposition.
I do follow your community. I'm not on Discord. I'm just on your Telegram group, but I follow the community. And one of the first things that really shocked me generally about a lot of, I would say, companies that are building on chain is that they're very good at getting a community. It's a priority for them. And most people think that when they start a company, they have to start promoting themselves on LinkedIn or other standard social networks, but that's not at all how it is here. And I found that shocking, almost as shocking as that people were swapping out my tomatoes. And that extent that it's a really massive community and there's so much engagement going on. It's is incredible. How does one even start getting that community going?
It's a constant battle to be relevant to people. But we're very lucky in the fact that people are passionate about their food. People are passionate about the world of agriculture, in a way that they may not be about a lot of the other real world asset use cases. Uh, but it's a constant battle to remain relevant, and also to encourage people to understand what you are. And it's something that we're always thinking of. But you should have fun with it. It's like one of the first livestock trades we did was we traded a royal bull on chain. And if you go onto our Twitter, we actually have a webcam of this bull now. It's a beautiful thing, the sort of Agri-Dex bull, and we're letting people vote on the name of it, which we're going to kind of release tomorrow. And we try to have fun with stuff like that. We're doing a vote on some of the new commodities and trade flows that we should be putting on chain, and there's some wacky stuff around that. So like you want to have a laugh with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's like don't forget to live, right? So you're building something, but you gotta live. It's part of who you are. It's your everyday, and I think that's fantastic. That's a great concept. Yeah, I'm quite curious to know which name will win. Hopefully, we'll drop it in the comments below when this goes live. What about the idea that this should be everybody's interest? Like, is there a global good that you think that AgriDex is actually serving?
It's a good question. We have an Agri-Dex Foundation, and that's headed up by David Campbell, OBE, and he's actually run a series of Africa's largest impact media groups. One of them including Shamba Shape Up, which is basically where people, a little bit like Pimp My Ride in America, you can win the rights to have your small scale farm shaped up, and they come in and the experts show you how to better manage it. But what that means is millions of farmers around Africa watch this for fun, or hoping that they'll go on the show and see how to better manage their own small scale farms. And it's been hugely effectual. You've seen massive increases in yield in certain regions that watch the show. And he's agreed to be the chairman of our foundation, and we're going to be routing capital both to him and to other projects going forwards. So there's definitely a societal good outside of just what we believe we're doing with AgriDex. And based on how successful we become long term, we'll absolutely be further incentivizing him and other projects that we believe help with food education. It's definitely the first thing in my mind, and something that I'm very, very keen to see more of.
You said that the AgriDex handles like large scale or like large volumes of trade. Does that mean does that include small farmers, or how would small farmers get involved?
It can. The technology is usable for everyone. That right now, our first rollout stuff is we're focusing on the largest use cases. We have a range of quite big launch partners that we're onboarding, and it's impossible to boil the ocean all at once. So we're doing it in a staggered approach.
Oh, that's exciting. So the first sets of trade hasn't really happened yet, other than the name of the bull. I guess that's sort of
Yeah, well, we've
something.
done wines out of South Africa. We've done olive oils out of Africa. Coffee. We're going to be announcing some stuff around coffee this week. So we're adding as we go products, but our big rollout is happening right now. You're just in time to catch the upwards trajectory of this all.
And where do you guys see yourself 1 year from now? So you said you wake up every morning thinking about like company, the achievements for the day.
Yeah, I see within a year us having a fully usable insurance platform, financial products, so that farmers can borrow both for planting and trading agricultural goods, a fully working trackable system, and a team that's gone to 50, and revenues that have gone to the tens of millions. That's where I see us in a year.
Where do you as an individual, like not necessarily AgriDex, but just you personally stand on, like, what is your viewpoint in terms of crop yields moving forward with climate change. I don't know. I didn't ask you if you believe in climate change. It can be a very controversial question when posed.
I think what everyone should be worried about, because I think climate change in of itself can be exclusionary to some people. I think what everyone should care about is protecting soil. We've seen from the Dust Bowls of America in the 30s to desertification in southern Sahara regions. Like it's incredibly important, and we see what happens when you don't treat soil well. So relentlessly focusing on overall yield I don't believe is the answer. It may work in the Midwest where you have access to great inputs and you can regularly top up, I guess, but it doesn't work well in a lot of the emergent world. So I think focusing on crops and custodying your soils in a better fashion is incredibly important. I think it's one of the 3 or 4 things that humanity needs to concentrate on the most. And I think it's been overlooked because it's not particularly sexy and it's harder to explain. But we need to stop focusing on yield alone and start focusing on protection of our biospheres.
And do you have, what do you think that most people underestimate about this, trading food?
Cover crop. People don't put enough cover crop in when they're growing.
What is cover crop?
Cover crop is crop that you let kind of then fall fallow to enrich the soil itself. And you can literally change the soil itself by having years or even decades of cover crop. It can go from very sort of acidic, low grade soil to something very different if you can continually sort of invest in your soil itself. So I think encouraging farmers by paying them better to think much more long term about how they value the soil itself is a great thing. And something that I think we should see more of.
Is that something that could be incentivized, do you think? Could AgriDex down the future incentivize cover crop?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I think it definitely is. But I think it'll be incentivized by showing the ability, as I said earlier, for farmers to be able to tell their story and to be able to show a higher value for their product itself. And then they can reroute some of those profits into the right thing. I don't think that there's many farmers who get into it for the money. A lot of them are just surviving, even the ones that we would call large farmers. So I think high profitability will allow them to better resource the positives.
All right. So Henry, I have one last question for you, and that is, I'm quite curious to know what I haven't asked you that you either expected me to ask or that you think is a question that you wish people would ask you but don't.
Yeah, I guess how can I get involved in the community itself? And I would say for anyone listening who's interested, we have a great Twitter, the AgriDex platform. Please engage on that. We have a wonderful Discord if you use that, a Telegram channel, and our website itself. We're driven both in terms of our success, but in terms of our vision by the people who engage with us. And I would love it for anyone listening who has a passion either for food, blockchain, crypto, or just for technology itself to take a look at us.
All right. Well, now we know where to find you. And I think I really like the idea of finding the story behind my food. I do see that as the future. I want to know what I'm eating. I want to know where it comes from, and I want to know who handled it. And I want to also know that by choosing to take those actions, that I'm supporting a healthier environment, not just for me, but for my family and my friends and and their families and their kids. Yeah. So thank you so much, Henry, for joining us on Bonded by Science. And we will be in touch again soon.
Shellie, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone else.